In the last chapter of the Quran, which is, I'm sure, memorized by all of the Muslims here, including our Hafiz who read so eloquently at the start of the program, we read, قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ. Say, I seek refuge in the Lord of mankind. Malik al-Nas, the King of mankind. Ilah al-Nas, the God of mankind. So what is the word for God there in the Arabic? It is Ilah. So that is an exact equivalent of what we mean by God in English. So what would be the proper translation then of Allah? Well, most Muslims would prefer to think that there is no translation for Allah. Allah is just simply now the personal name of the one true God. But if we wanted a translation, for the sake of communicating the message, we would say the God, borrowing on the etymology, a possible etymology of how the word Allah came to be pronounced as it is. So the kalima of Islam, the proclamation of the faith of the Muslims, is that there is no God but God. There is no ilah except Allah. Allah is the only ilah. So there are many things that people worship, which we might refer to as ilah or aliha, gods. But for Muslims, there is only one God. There is only one true God in fact. Not only for Muslims, but in fact. And that one true God Muslims refer to by the name Allah. Now I spent some time on the name Allah because it is so often misunderstood, both by Muslims and by non-Muslims. Some non-Muslims misunderstood the Muslim reference to Allah as though Muslims are referring to some other foreign, strange God. But let everyone be assured that when Muslims say Allah, they are referring to the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham and Moses and Jesus. But if that's the name of God, and if the word Allah refers to the same God as the Bible, what is the concept of God in the Bible? Now, I'll have to devote some time to speak of the concept of God in Christianity in particular. So for this part, I will talk about the projection or the manner in which God is shown to be in the Bible in a more general way. And for that, I will concentrate a little bit on the Old Testament, or on the Jewish scriptures, the Tanakh. Since the God that is depicted in the Old Testament is the God that Jews, Christians, and Muslims can agree on. That, to us, is God. Even though Christians would have some nuances in their own faith regarding God, and Muslims would have some nuances in their own faith regarding God. But when we think of the identity of that God, that is the one we're talking about. Jews, Christians, and Muslims can agree on this. The God of the book of Genesis. Now, when we read the Bible, we see that God is a very powerful individual. So Muslims, Jews, and Christians can agree that God is omnipotent, which means that God can do everything that is logically possible. And that God is omniscient, which again means that God knows everything that's logically knowable. And God is extremely merciful and loving and kind. This is borne out in many passages. Not only in the Old Testament, but also in the Quran, and of course, this is quite emphasized in the New Testament of the Christian Bible. God not only creates the world, but God continues to sustain the world. Deists in the Middle Ages spoke of Newtonian physics as though that is the final explanation for the way in which the world works. And that led to an idea that is known as deism. The idea that you have God who created the world, but then put it in motion like a clockwork, in which everything continues to function according to certain natural laws. In which case, everything is on autopilot, so to speak. And in that case, you do not need the pilot, because everything is in autopilot. In that case, God doesn't need to be there. God does not interfere with the world, doesn't do anything in the world. There's no such thing as a miracle. There are no revelations to prophets and messengers. God just simply created the world, put it into motion, and then the world runs as it is. God may be on holiday, or maybe not. He does not even exist. So that leads to the modern idea of atheism, or it emphasized or lent credence to and supported the full-blown atheism that we're actually seeing now. But Muslims, Jews, and Christians will think of God as not in this deistic concept, but as being fully and completely or continuously involved in the affairs of the world. The Quran in Surah 55 says, كُلَّ يَوْمٍ هُوَ فِي شَأْنٍ. Every day he is involved in some affair. God is continually protecting and preserving the universe with us in it. Now we have well, you can't see it now, but obviously there is still a projection on the screen, though you cannot see it to the bright lights. But you understand that that projection on the screen is coming from a source. And if the source is shut down, then so too would be the projection on the screen. The entire image would all be gone. If I use that as an analogy, think of us as being created by God, and here we are, the image that God created. But that image is not created once and then left there. It's continually being maintained and cherished and nourished by the God who created it. So that if God should no longer be in existence, if we are just simply to even imagine that for a moment, though that would be logically impossible, but if we were to think of that for a moment, then if God were not to exist, neither would we exist. In a similar way that if we were to shut down the projector, we would not be able to see the image anymore. So that is the conception, really, that I understand Muslims, Jews, and Christians to have. Because we speak, for example, in the Quran of God being Rabbul Alameen. He is the Lord of the worlds. And the word Rabb in Arabic actually involves the idea of taking care, of cherishing and nurturing. God not only creates the world, but he continues to nurture and cherish and to preserve the world with us in it. In the Old Testament, and also in the Quran, and to a large extent the New Testament, let me correct that, and definitely also in the New Testament, God is depicted continuously and categorically as being one God. We mentioned the books of Moses and the covenant that God made with Moses. In the book of Deuteronomy, one of these books, in chapter 6, verse 4, we have what is referred to as the Shema Israel. That is what Israel should listen to. And the verse reads, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one." So there's an emphasis on one God. And this becomes the most important commandment in the Bible. In fact, in the New Testament, which I mentioned and then I corrected myself, I wanted to give some room for a possible alternate view. But in fact, on second thoughts, the New Testament is clear that this indeed is the ultimate commandment. In the Gospel according to Mark, in chapter 12, verses 27 and forward, a man comes and asks Jesus, "Teacher, of all of the commandments, which is the greatest?" Because Jews had 613 commandments. So which of all of those, this person wants to know, which is the greatest commandment? And Jesus, of whom be peace, replied, "Of all of the commandments, the greatest is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one." So Jesus re-emphasized the same teaching. So throughout the Old Testament, not only in the book of Deuteronomy, and not only in chapter 6, verse 4, but in the rest of the Old Testament, in the rest of the Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures, and into the New Testament, we see that the proclamation is always that there is only one God. This becomes now the hallmark of Islam, the proclamation that there is only one God. If a person will declare there is only one God, then the promises of God is